Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own unique Black Belt leader within. Now, if you're a Disney fan, and many of us grew up watching Disney, probably one of the most beloved fans of Disney is Winnie the Pooh. And if you look at it, he really stands out as one of the more iconic franchises. But most people don't know the origin story of Winnie the Pooh. Now, I had an opportunity recently to dig into that, and I found it's an interesting story leading to an interesting lesson, and that's going to be the focus of this installment of Black Belt Leadership. So, for the next few minutes, allow me to share a very unique life lesson from one of Winnie the Pooh's most memorable moments. Tut tut, it looks like rain. Let's talk about a life lesson from Winnie the Pooh. Now, many people don't know that the original Winnie wasn't the bear that we see in the movies. It was a black cub. In 1914, a Canadian vet and a soldier, his name was Harry Colburn, he bought a little black bear cub for 20 bucks while he was headed on a train for World War I. He named the little black bear Winnie after his hometown of Winnipeg. When he was deployed to France with his military unit, he left Winnie at the London Zoo, where she quickly became a beloved, gentle favorite among the visitors. Now, in 1921, author A. Milne, he brought his son, Christopher Robin, a stuffed bear from Harrods for his first birthday. So Christopher Robin named his bear Edward, but later renamed the bear Winnie the Pooh after he had an opportunity to visit the real Winnie at the London Zoo. He combined that name with the name of a swan that the family had met while on holiday. Now, fast forward a little bit later, inspired by his son and his son's nursery toys, Piglet, Eeyore, and Tigger, A. Min published the very first Pooh story in a London newspaper on Christmas Eve, 1925. Less than a year later, the classic book, Winnie the Pooh, it debuted on October 14th, 1926. And in 1966, Walt Disney bought the rights to the characters and from there created the iconic animated franchise that we know today. Now, Winnie the Pooh is known for two things: his trademark red shirt and his enduring love of honey. And in one of the classic installments, Winnie the Pooh rolls in the mud, hoping to disguise himself as a little black rain cloud. He's doing so the bees won't notice as he's reaching for their honey. He uses a balloon to lift him high into the air, and as Pooh approaches the hive nestled in a tree, the bees, suspicious of his intentions, begin to swarm around him. Well, in desperation, Pooh cries out to Christopher Robin to walk up and down with an umbrella, saying, "Tut tut, it looks like rain." And they begin to sing, "I'm just a little black rain cloud." Well, needless to say, the ploy didn't work, and the more and more the bees began to swarm around Pooh, he finally decides and announces to Christopher Robin, these are the wrong sort of bees. He then asks Christopher Robin to shoot the balloon with his pop gun. So Christopher Robin complies, popping the balloon, and Pooh falls to the ground, hungry but otherwise unharmed. Now, real clouds aren't formed by rolling in the mud, contrary to what Pooh may think. Real clouds are formed by evaporation, rising warm air, and condensation. When the sun heats water on the earth, it transforms into an invisible gas we call water vapor. The water vapor rises into the sky, and as it does, it cools down and begins to stick to tiny floating particles in the air to form what we know as visible water droplets. And billions of these droplets combined to form a cloud. Now, as the cloud grows in size, more droplets form, sticking together to form even larger droplets. And at some point, the droplets become too heavy to be supported by the air, so they begin to fall back to the earth as rain. And depending on the size of the cloud, as well as the presence of any atmospheric instability, rainfall can vary from a sprinkle to a raging thunderstorm. Now, wind, rain, hail, tornadoes, even hurricanes, they all have the very same origin in this simple process of the sun warming the earth, turning water into vapor, and seeing the vapor rise and cool and collect and form into clouds. Like it or not, it's a cycle. It's one of the cycles of life. The water that rises to the air later returns to water the earth. And then, guess what? The process repeats itself. And how often it does that is going to be based on the atmospheric conditions at the time. But this cycle of rain and sun continues just as it's done for millennia. Now, when the conditions are right, we get to enjoy a sunny day. But when the conditions aren't right, we get to make the most of a cloudy day. And when the conditions are just right, we get to experience a rainy day. But there are times when a rainy day becomes a stormy day, and sometimes with catastrophic results. You know, life is a lot like that. The challenges and obstacles that we face, the adverse events that we go through, all those things like a storm are something that we deal with over time. Given the right conditions, they show up often unexpectedly, but thankfully, just like a storm, the challenges and obstacles and adverse events we face through life, none of those are permanent. But like a storm, if we're paying attention, we can see the warning signs. We can see what's coming so we can make preparation. You know, one of the things I find fascinating is just as the clouds rarely surprise a meteorologist, a crisis should rarely surprise a leader. Now, my grandson and I were recently in the backyard. We were playing fetch with my dogs, Oliver, Armani, Marley, and Holly. And as we were having fun in the middle of this incredible sunny day, we were interrupted as a series of clouds suddenly blew in from the west. And as the sky began to turn dark and even darker, the light began to dim. Now, my grandson commented the sun had disappeared, and that became a teachable moment that I took advantage of. I reminded my grandson that even though the clouds had dimmed the light of the sun was still shining. And later that night, we walked outside to look up into a cloudy, starless sky. I was able to remind him once again that even though the clouds may be hiding the light of the stars, the moon is still reflecting the light of the sun. The stars are still shining. And once the wind ended up pushing the clouds further east, guess what? The sun and the moon and the stars, they all returned. You know, from there, my grandson and I began to talk about something I want to share with you in this conversation today. You know, in life, we're going to have some sunny days when everything's great. But there's going to be times in our life when life offers up a challenge and on occasion, a crisis that we're going to have to deal with. Well, it's all part of the human experience and we're all going to deal with them. We can't always avoid them, but we can and we will get through them, but only if we're willing to find the sun that's shining once the clouds pass by. Now, there's going to be times in life when you and I experience fear, we experience disappointment, or we experience a loss. There's going to be times in life when we fail. This is, if you've heard me say many times, the yin and the yang of life. Just like you can't have daytime without nighttime, you can't have the sun without rain. And just because we're experiencing fear or disappointment or loss or failure in the moment, it doesn't mean that hope isn't still shining. We just can't see it right now. Now, it's important to remember that clouds affect our visibility, but they don't change reality. Now, it's been said that the setbacks we experience are often nothing more than our very next setup for success. I believe that to be true. But like the storms that roll in at times to disrupt our day, we often forget when we're in the middle of a crisis, as stormy it may be, that we're actually experiencing the seeds of our future success. You got to remember that every single storm serves a purpose because in nature, nothing's wasted. The wind scatters the seed and the rain softens the soil, making it receptive to actually receive the seed. And then the water does a second job. It nourishes that seed so it can germinate and grow. Lightning releases atmospheric nitrogen that falls to the earth with the rain, and that fertilizes the soil. And then the sun returns, driving photosynthesis, the energy that's necessary for plant growth. Again, it's the cycle, or to borrow a phrase from The Lion King, it's the circle of life. You know, when the storms come, they refill the rivers, which in turn replenishes the lakes and the reservoirs. The wind and the rain clean the atmosphere of pollutants, and they do their part to reshape the landscape. So, I mean, if you think about it in short, without the storms that we experience in life, the cycle is broken and nothing would grow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that life works the exact same way. Growth in our lives rarely occurs when we're comfortable. Most of the growth that we experience and the biggest growth that we experience are at times when life gets disrupted. It's at times when things get uncomfortable because it's in those times of disruption and discomfort That's when we have the opportunity to learn and grow. But it's also where our character is tested. Comfort may maintain us, but it's the storms of life that can transform us. But it's important to remember that the storms don't create the character. The character just is revealed in the storm. You got to remember that every storm carries with it the seeds of future growth. But that can only happen if we're willing to learn while it's still raining outside. Now, not every storm is the same, and different storms require a different response. A single umbrella won't solve every weather problem that we face. Now, while an umbrella might do well in a gentle rainstorm, it's not going to do much if you're caught outside in the middle of a Class 2 hurricane. And it's probably not going to help a lot if it's dropping baseball-sized hail in the middle of a hailstorm. And leadership works the very same way. You're likely going to need more than one strategy in life to be able to combat the many crises that you and I are going to experience as we go through life. And what worked for a financial setback may not work in the middle of a relational conflict. And what worked when you're experiencing a health issue may not work when you're experiencing or dealing with a catastrophic loss. But here's the good news. The average thunderstorm lasts somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. And even a massive supercell has an average life expectancy of only 2 to 6 hours. So unless you happen to live on Jupiter, storms are temporary. And once the storm concludes, renewal starts to begin. I mean, think about it. When the storm comes, the plants take in the water. The seeds start to germinate. They absorb the water and the nitrogen that's been released into the ground. And then the sun returns and it triggers photosynthesis into the plants and it causes the plants to grow. After the storm, growth continues. Now, again, it's important to remember that no thunderstorm lasts forever. And in the same token, neither does our grief, a setback, a disappointment, or a failure. One of the ancient stories that's been attributed to King Solomon tells the story of a king who asked a very wise man for a ring. The king wanted a ring that would make him happy during the hard times and would make him humble in the good times. The wise man granted the king's request. He presented him with a ring that was inscribed with the following phrase, "This too shall pass." So this story serves as a reminder that the pain we may be experiencing in life doesn't last forever, but the happiness we had at some point is going to be interrupted. Yes, there's going to be rainy days, and yes, there's going to be cloudy days, and yes, sometimes we're going to experience a storm in our life. But in all these situations, take heart in this. This too shall pass. But what happens after the storm? Well, if you pause and think about any storm that we've gone through in life, after a physical storm comes a clear sky. We experience a quiet calm. There's a tangible freshness in the air, and there's a noticeable drop in the temperature. And as the sun returns, what does it do? It illuminates the remaining raindrops, causing the sky to light up with vibrant color. We often see a rainbow after the storm. And because the rain has flushed the dust and the debris from the sky, our view of the world around us is sharper and clearer than it was before. What I love about it is the fact that our perspective and our visibility have been enhanced. And the storm, once it's done, allows us to see things more clearly. And guess what? The same is true in life. Now, a few weeks ago, I was awakened in the middle of the night to a violent storm. The roar of the storm and the whipping of the wind was intense. And in the darkness, you could literally hear the groaning of the trees in my backyard as they bent and they swayed in the wind. And as quickly as it struck our neighborhood, in just a matter of moments, the storm was over. I rolled over and went back to sleep. So the very next morning, I got up and I pulled the curtains back to see what damage, if any, had been done. There were weak and dead tree limbs scattered all across my lawn, but thankfully, the trampoline was still there. And despite the violence of the storm, our backyard had escaped pretty much unscathed. To me, it was a reminder that even the most violent storms can't move the tree whose roots are deeply planted in the soil. And ladies and gentlemen, leadership works the same way. You got to remember, storms don't create character. Storms reveal it, they refine it, and they often redirect it in our lives. You got to remember, every single storm carries with it the seeds of future growth if we're willing to learn while it's still raining. Now, another thing I like about storms is the fact that storms can reveal existing vulnerabilities, and that can lead to innovation. Today we've got modern building codes due in part to the lessons we've learned from previous storms. In hurricane-prone areas, many homes today have storm shutters. They've got impact-resistant laminated glass. They've got wind-rated garage doors. They've got secondary water barriers and even flood vents. Because of what's happened in the past, they're prepared for the future. And every single one of those innovations are the result of identifying an existing vulnerability in building materials and construction techniques. The lessons revealed in the middle of the storm have shown us how we can build better and stronger and create a more resilient structure. But the very same thing applies to our lives as you and I go through the challenges, the obstacles, and the crises of life. The lessons we learn in the midst of the storm and the lessons that we apply to our life, what do? They make us better, they make us stronger, and they ultimately create a more resilient version of ourselves. A business improves because it learns from previous failures. A relationship is strengthened because it learns from prior conflict. Leaders get better by leading when they learn from their prior mistakes. Resilience comes as a result of experiencing and overcoming adversity and adapting to the difficult challenges over time. Now, every single black belt in life has weathered a storm, and every single black belt in the gym understands this. In the gym, you endure injuries, you fail tests, you experience a loss in the ring, you deal with personal setbacks on this journey from white belt to black belt. And the journey from novice to mastery, it's one of persistence, of diligence, of dedication, and resilience. The belt we wear is a testimony to the fact that we didn't quit along the way. Now, in the book of Genesis, we read the story of Noah, and we all equate Noah to the biblical flood, that deluge that covered the earth for more than a year. But while we remember the flood, we often forget about the preparation. Biblical scholars tell us that they believe it took Noah and his sons between 50 and 75 years to build and furnish the ark. And they also had to gather the food and all the supplies that would be required to feed all the animals that came 2 by 2. So it's important to remember the ark wasn't built during the storm. It was built before the rain ever started. And that's why leaders daily learn and grow so they can daily prepare themselves for what's coming next. And in that very same light, in the books of Matthew and Mark and Luke, we read the story of Jesus where he calmed the storm. What I find interesting about that particular story is that his disciples who were in the boat with him, many of them had spent their life on the water. But when the storm came, they began to panic. But Jesus, a carpenter by trade, he was asleep in the back of the boat. And when he was awakened, the very first thing he did is he asked his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" And then the scripture says he rebuked the wind and he said to the waves, "Be still." And the sea became as calm as glass. Leaders don't ignore the storms, nor did they deny them. But when everyone else is in a panic because of the storm, here's what I love. Leaders show up and they respond a little different. Leadership isn't about controlling the weather. It's about controlling how you respond when the weather turns bad. We're all going to experience the storms of life at some point in our lives. So we can choose to be bitter or we can choose to be better. Good news and the bad news, we get to choose. So as I get ready to wrap up, I want to return to our opening story, and I want to go back to Winnie the Pooh and the cloudy day. Now, I love the fact that Winnie believed if he pretended it was raining, he could trick the bees and he could get the honey that he craved. But what he learned is an all too important lesson that many of us often overlook or ignore. The storms in life are going to come whether we want them or not. They're just going to show up because that's a part of life. The clouds are going to gather, and at some point, the wind's going to blow. The lightning's going to flash, and the thunder's going to roll. And at some point, the rain's going to come, and then the rain's going to go. But the question at the end of it is whether we'll learn and whether we'll grow. Now, I believe black belt leaders do 4 things to ensure they make the most of the storms of life. First, they forecast the storm. They learn to recognize the signs of a looming crisis, and that gives them time to repair. Secondly, they face the storm because when adversity comes, they stay calm and they lead with courage. The third thing leaders do is they find purpose in the storm. Every single storm, every single crisis that you and I are going to face has a lesson to teach us if we're open and willing to learn. And finally, leaders finish strong. They apply the lesson they've learned so they can rebuild themselves and those they're leading better, faster, and stronger. They use those lessons to strengthen their resilience and to prepare for what the future may bring. You got to remember, black belt leaders don't control the letter, but they develop the mindset, the discipline, and the character to lead through whatever the weather brings their way. So the next time you're going to face a storm, don't ask, why is this happening to me? Storms happen to all of us. Instead, ask a better question. What is this storm wanting to build inside of me? Because the struggles we rightly use, they help us grow, they help us mature, and they help us improve. So the next time someone tells you, tut tut, it looks like rain, suit up, lean in, and let it rain. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.